Um, Speaking here with Nancy Presley here for the recording about a little bit about the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, but particularly about their participation in the International Medical Device Regulation Forum. And so, Nancy, maybe you can just talk about how you got involved.
Well, I got involved in IMDRF on some of the post-market work that's being done. I originally got involved in the working group that was looking at reimagining, revamping the old NCAR system, which is the notified, I don't even remember what NCAR stands for right now.
Sharing post-market surveillance data between countries?
Yes, it is the sharing. It is the in a formalized mechanism. So there had been an NCAR system under the old GHTF, but it was felt that that was not working for a lot of countries. So when IMDRF came into existence, that was one of the early on projects that they took on, was looking at the NCAR system and how to improve it. And I do believe it's improved, though some would argue that it's not as all-encompassing as it used to be. The participation is a little bit more limited because it's limited to participants of IMDRF. And so that does, though, include all of Europe, all of the European Union, but it's limited to other countries outside of there who participate in IMDRF. And the main difference between the old system and the new is that what we've really felt like there needed to be confidentiality agreements in place so that regulators could share non-public information. And that was seen to be the biggest downside of the old system under GHTF, that for a lot of people, it was just sharing information that was already out in the public about recalls, about field service correction activities. And while that does have a place for a lot of us participating in the program, such as the US or the Australians or the Japanese, we didn't feel we needed that type of information. We had that information. It was in the public. So the old NCAR system was not really serving a purpose for us. So the system was revamped, and now we have the ability to designate items that we share as either confidential or not confidential. If it's confidential, we only share it with the other countries that we have confidentiality agreements with. And if it's public, then we can share it with everyone. But that allows us to share information earlier on in the investigatory process. Let other countries know if there's something that we're concerned about that we think they might be interested in, or even more so, being able to go out to other countries and saying, hey, we've got a concern about this product or company or whatever, and we have some questions for you to see if you've seen anything. So we have the ability now to actually use the NCAR program to put out inquiries to other countries. And that really has better opened the lines of communication for sharing information at an earlier stage and being able to get a better idea and better feedback about what's going on in other places in the world when somebody has a concern. So that's kind of where the NCAR program is going. after I was involved in that, I also got drawn into the adverse event criminology working group from IMDRF, and that working group is still open. We actually have been harmonizing the event terminology and coding that's used to describe adverse events. In the U.S., this is what goes along with our MDR system and was previously known as our device problem codes, our patient problem codes, our manufacturer evaluation codes, and our component codes. All of those have been updated, revamped, and harmonized across all the IMDRF regulators. And they are now in various stages of implementation in different countries. We just released the last of the coding sets that we were working on, which was the component codes, were finalized this past spring. So we are in the process of implementing those. I know the European Union is in the process of implementing all of the coding sets, but we believe that this will make it easier for countries, manufacturers that are doing business in multiple countries, that if they are using the same coding for all of their adverse events, they're not switching coding sets between jurisdictions when they're sending in adverse events. And additionally, it'll make it easier for the jurisdictions, for the regulators to share information because we have harmonized on how we're coding them. So we're all using like terminology now. And we're hoping to spread this out in the future mainly to other aspects of adverse event reporting, but that's still kind of a wish down the road right now.
This is great, Nancy. Let me ask you this. The sharing of post-market surveillance data in organized and perhaps standardized ways to talk about adverse events in organized and standardized ways. How do you think clinical engineers can use the results of IMDRF or perhaps contribute to IMDRF in those areas, which seem to be, we know a whole lot about managing medical devices, once they're in the market?
Right. I think there's definitely a role for clinical engineering to play as we develop these things, whether it be the NCAR system and the sharing of information, or the terminology, probably even more so in the terminology than the NCAR, because the NCAR is really regulator to regulator. But the terminology is out there for anybody to use. There's actually a I'm not sure the best way to describe it, kind of a search engine that's been developed. It's on the IMDRF website now, so that if you have something that you're trying to code, you can put in their terms and it will find codes for you that you can then select from. It would be great if people in the hospitals, beyond just, the manufacturers and the regulators, were using similar coding to code what's going on. I think it will make for more seamless look at what's happening if we get all levels to kind of harmonize on how we refer to things and how we code them and the types of things that we use. Sure. I know for some of our coding, particularly for our patient coding, a lot of people have just said, why don't you just use MedRA or what's out there? And the problem is, for medical device adverse events, we don't need coding that goes that granular. We what we need is at a higher level. We don't want to inundate people with thousands and thousands and thousands of codes that they have to wade through to pick something. But we are working with MEDRA to assure that anything that's in IMDRF under the what was previously the patient problem codes in the U.S., but are now referred to as the health effects, are in at MEDRA. So that essentially our coding is a subset of MEDRA. And MEDRA is actually now adding some device problem codes in, and things that they had to describe device problems in the past, they're harmonizing them with what IMDRF has put out, so that there's a little bit better alignment there. So they're
for those on the phone that aren't from the U.S., I mean, that may listen to this, talk a little bit about the MEDRA system you're mentioning.
Yeah, MEDRA is an international system that comes up with medical terms to describe everything, mainly patient conditions, patient problems. I am definitely not a MEDRA expert, but in the clinical area, MEDRA is widely used across a lot of countries.
This is like the ICD code.
It's very similar to the ICD, yes.
Okay.
It's very similar to that. Some might say it's a competing coding system. They are a little bit different from each other. We actually had, in addition to talking with MEDRA, we talked with ICD when we were putting the terminology together, and we plan on working with them in the future to work on our alignment with them so that we can map the IMDRF terms to the ICD. I think they're up to 11. Is it ICD 11 now?
Treatment code.
You know, mapping it to that. And so that's also a future effort that we will be working on.
Well, Nancy, maybe to bring this close to a close, and I appreciate your time and your input. So the IFMBE Clinical Engineering Division has a regulation project, and you were invited to discuss with them about a year and a half ago, and and we would have been moving faster with this project, but of course COVID hit 6 months ago, and so we've been focused there.
Right.
But when we talked, we looked at the IMDRF, formerly GHTF groups, and we talked about, so where's the clinical engineering role? Where can we best contribute? Where can we get the voice into the global regulatory medical device process, like Adriana Velasquez of WHO wants us to have that voice appropriately, and you've been a part of that voice, and how do we grow that? And, we said, well, what's natural for clinical engineers? And one answer was post-market surveillance. I mean,
right.
Another area was cybersecurity, and then another areas that we need to explore is what's our role, the growing clinical engineering role in the digital health world that I know that's going to be part of IMDRF purview. So any closing thoughts about all that?
I think that what you have identified, the places that I would say are the key places for clinical engineers. So one more that maybe, and I'm not exactly sure of the direction that they're going, is the artificial intelligence in medical devices.
Sure.
May also be an area of interest to the clinical engineers.
No question. In fact, we include that definition in digital health, but I appreciate you breaking it out, because you and I know there's a whole lot of that happening.
Right. Yes. I mean, and I'm saying it that way because there's actually a specific IMDRF work item, that's artificial intelligence medical devices. So, I mean, I think that would be a working group. Digital health is obviously way too broad a topic area for IMDRF to handle in that way. So that's why it's more targeted with specific, chunks, if you will, to work on.
Sure.
So I do think that that's one of those areas. And I think any way that you can get it involved, you know, it is the regulators forum, but they do have outside participating groups, and depending on the particular committee, how they use those groups. You know, a lot of times, you know, we would invite outside groups to the terminology group. They'd come for part of the meeting, and then the rest of the meeting was closed to the only be, you know, the regulatory and the IMDRF members. But, you know, we do appreciate and realize that that perspective is useful and helpful. So, but I guess, you know, just as one step back to keep in mind, you know, one of the reasons GHTF sort of started not being meeting the needs that were found was because the regulators needed that forum to be able to speak openly with each other, because they had confidentiality agreements with each other and could talk about things that can't be talked about in public. That is one of the driving forces for going the IMDRF route the way it is now. So I just want people to keep that in mind, why everything is not open across the board.
Sure.
So,
one other comment related to that, when this CED project group led by Peter Granger of Ireland and Fabiola Martinez of Mexico, and has other members that day when Nancy joined us with Antonio Hernandez, you know, formerly from Tahoe. Anyway, people with a wide view of medical devices and healthcare. We humbly came up that day and said, so what's the gaps in IMDRF? I say that seriously, humbly, because, you know, we're speaking about an important group around the world that's been around for a good while. But it was we talked about post-market mandatory reporting to regulatory authorities. In other words, when a medical device doesn't perform like it's supposed to in the real world post-market, there is something about, as we've already talked about, mandatory reporting about those problems, but not necessarily near misses. And the clinical engineering community around the world that's involved on the front lines in hospitals and medical devices use every day sees those near misses. And so that may, you know, if we were to, you know, create some sort of network where we could appropriately share that, and, you know, that's tricky. I realize that's tricky because you don't want to put down a manufacturer inappropriately. But, you know, the different ways, you know, in that post-market world that maybe clinical engineers could uniquely contribute. So something to be thought about.
I think that's a great idea.
Well, very good. I appreciate your time. Any final thoughts?
Right. I think we've covered it all.
I appreciate your time.
Absolutely.
And we will, you know, edit this tape and show it to you, and you decide how we want to use it. You know, it may be only sort of internally, you know, to our board and collaborator group, you know, which we, of course, we wish you joined, but, you know, we know you're busy. And if you were to join that group, you know, and maybe you can't because of your role, but if you were, you know, participating would just be, you know, read through it late at night before you go to sleep, you know, our latest minutes, but not, you know, having to necessarily comment every time or any time.
Right.
So anyway, we'll talk about it later.
We can talk about that later.
Yeah, we'll talk about it after you've been to the beach and get a little bit more relaxed.
Yeah, and it may have to wait till after COVID isn't quite so taking so many resources from us right now. I mean, we're just inundated with emergency use authorizations in so many areas, and, you know, it's emptying out into, you know, to coming up with new processes and new ways to handle things, and even down to all of these EUA manufacturers and are not all medical device, you know, registered and listed. How do they report MDRs, because that's tied to their registration list. So, I mean, you know, people just say, oh, you're getting a lot more, files and submissions, and it's like, it goes so much beyond that, because
and then they lean
so
on
much uncharted territory.
They lean on those of you that have been there a while to go create all this new stuff.
Well, yeah, somewhat. So, okay.
Thank you, ma'am.
So you
Appreciate
take
it.
care. Stay
You
safe.
too.
Enjoy your family. And we'll
Thank you.
talk to you later.
Very good.
Bye.
Bye.